Hello and welcome. In this episode, we're going to look at the prizes and challenges within the English martial arts. The playing of a prize was an event which the maesters regarded as being of the utmost importance, not just for the applicant but for the organisation itself. Accordingly, prizes were played publicly. Not only that, people might witness for themselves the high standards set by the maesters, but also to prove that the examinations were honestly conducted. The basic or beginner's rank in the school offence was that of scholar. The manner of and rules for a scholar's enrolment are contained in the rules and constitutions of the school. The number of weapons at which the scholar trained was, in most cases, 2. There were, however, cases of scholars who trained at 3 weapons. The rules of the company appear to give the student some choice in this matter, in stating, for such weapons or weapons as the same scholar or scholars shall be willing to learn. Unlike the higher ranks, there was no minimum time span before the scholar could play his prize. It was left to his own judgment. However, the company of maesters, no doubt mindful of ambition's delusive powers, demanded proof of the scholar's readiness to attempt the prize. This took the form of a private test which required that he demonstrated his skill with the longsword and backsword against a minimum of 6 scholars. In order that his proficiency might be assessed, if his efforts were successful, the 4 ancient maesters would nominate a date and venue for the playing of his prize. It then fell to the applicant to publicly announce his forthcoming test by posting bills of challenge in and around the City of London. The records of the maesters themselves do not, unfortunately, contain any examples of such a document. However, it seems that the playwright, Ben Jonson, used such a bill as a vehicle for a comic sketch contained in his play Cynthia's Revel. Ben Jonson might be called a realist in literary terms and is well known for presenting life as he knew it. Since schools offence were prevalent during his lifetime, we may suppose that the above cameo is, allowing for artistic license, a reasonable representation of an actual bill of challenge. It might therefore prove interesting to rewrite his sketch, keeping the salient points and replacing the others with names and details which for this purpose are taken ad hoc from the company's records. Be it known to all that profess skill in the science of defence, that we, Richard Best, Robert Polmouth, Humphrey Bassett and John Legge, being the 4 ancient maesters of the said science of defence within the City of London, do give leave and licence to our Provost, William Hunt, to play his maester's prize against all maesters whatsoever in this subtle mystery at these 4 cunning weapons of defence, viz., the longsword, the bastard sword, the backsword, and the staff. These are therefore to give notice to all comers that he and said William Hunt is here present at his designed hour, at the Leaden Hall, the present day of the present month, to perform and do his uttermost for the achievement and bearing away of the prize. The form of a bill of challenge, as above assumed, varies little, in essence, to one that was issued by a stage gladiator in 1712. I, James Miller, sergeant, lately come from the frontiers of Portugal, master of the noble science of defence, hearing in most places where I have been of the great fame of Timothy Buck of London, master of the said science, do invite him to meet me and exercise at the several weapons following: backsword, sword and dagger, sword and buckler, single falchion, case of falchion, and quarterstaff. Stage gladiators only had to fight the particular person they had challenged, whereas the prizes of early days would have to fight as many people as answered their bills of challenge. The maesters, with customary efficiency, put the terms and conditions of the scholar's prize in writing so that there could be no confusion or dispute about the procedure. If we accept Johnson's description of a bill of challenge, it would seem churlish not to accept his information relating to the number of bouts fought. He was, after all, a contemporary of the maesters of defence. Nevertheless, an entry in the company's files would appear to contradict him. This occurs in the record of Gregory Green's Provost Prize, which mentions one of his opponents, Isaac Kennard, only playing 2 bouts with the longsword because of an injured hand. The very fact that this detail was recorded suggests that the 2 bouts was not the norm. Robert Triphook's Miscellany Antique Anglicana, published in 1816, contains a fascinating tale from the reign of Henry VIII concerning the marvellous Long Meg of Westminster that seemed to support the 3-bout theory. Long Meg was furious at a man named Warner who had eaten her other guests' breakfasts and refused to pay for more than one. In her anger, Long Meg challenged Worcester to take that staff and have a bout with me for thy breakfast. He that gives the first 3 pennies escape free. Further support for this hypothesis comes from the pen of George Silver, a contemporary, though probably amateur, master of defence who, in suggesting a way to test a foreign master's proficiency to teach arms in England, says that they should fight 3 bouts apiece with 3 of the best English masters of defence. Unfortunately, the problem is not that easily solved, since in another part of his work, Silver tells us, when condemning the principles and other methods of Vincent Saviolo, that, and again for proof that there is no truth, neither in his rules, grounds, or rapier fight, let trial be made in this manner. Set 2 unskilled men together at the rapier and dagger, being valiant, and you shall see that once in 2 bouts there shall either one or both of them be hurt. Then set 2 skilful men together, being valiant at the rapier and dagger, and they shall do the like. Here are some examples from the official records of the Company of Maesters. They provide graphic evidence of the immense effort required of the prizer. Edward Harvey played his scholar's prize at the ball within Bishopsgate at 2 weapons, the 2-hand sword and the sword and buckler. William Matthew played his scholar's prize at the ball within Bishopsgate at 2 kind of weapons, the 2-hand sword and the backsword. John Blenkinsopps played his scholar's prize under William Glover at Burntwood in Essex at 3 weapons, the longsword, the backsword, the sword and buckler. Thomas Noble played his scholar's prize at the ball within Bishopsgate on the 6th of February at 2 weapons, that is to say, the longsword and the sword and buckler. Robert Bliss played his scholar's prize at the ball in Bishopsgate at 5th day of June at 2 kind of weapons, and that is to say, the 2-hand sword and the sword and buckler. And Roger Horne played his scholar's prize at Oxford at 2 kinds of weapons, that is to say, the 2-hand sword and the sword and buckler. Those scholars who succeeded in bearing away the prize were granted the rank of free scholar. According to the rules, they had to remain at this rank for 7 years, though there were exceptions to this. Before they could apply to play their Provost Prize, as was the case with the Scholar's Prize, the rules for this were laid down by the Maesters. The order of the Provost's Prize. Imprimis, that every free scholar, which is minded to proceed to any other degree of the noble science of defence, to be a Provost, shall first desire his own Maester's goodwill, and then his Maester and he together shall go to the 4 ancient Maesters and inform them of his Provost's Prize and that he is willing to play it. And if it chance that the free scholar's Maester whom he was sworn unto be deceased, that then the said free scholar shall choose for his master one of the ancient Maesters to play his Provost's Prize under, which he hath most mind unto, and shall be sworn to him, as he was to his first Maester in all points. The following examples of Provost's Prizes have been taken from the official records of the Maesters. John Evans, ALS Gherkin Maker, played his Provost's Prize in Hertford under William Glover, ALS Thompson, at 3 weapons, the longsword, the backsword, and the sword and buckler. Isaac Kennard played his Provost's Prize at the ball within Bishopsgate at 3 weapons, the longsword, the sword and buckler, and the staff. Gregory Green played his Provost's Prize on the 10th day of October at the ball within Bishopsgate, at 3 weapons, the longsword, the backsword, and the sword and buckler. John Blenkinsopps played his Provost prize at the 9th day of June at the ball within Bishopsgate at 3 weapons, the longsword, the backsword, and the staff. Edward Harvey played his Provost prize at 3 weapons, the two-hand sword, the backsword, and the sword and buckler. The order for playing of a Maester's prize. When any Provost is minded to take the degree of Maester, that is to play a Maester's prize, he shall first declare his mind unto his Maester, under whom he played his Provost's prize. If he be living, and if he be dead, then shall he choose for his master one of the 4 ancient Maesters to play his prize under. The following examples of Maester's prizings are of extra importance because they bear witness to the interest shown by English monarchs in the affairs of the Maesters of Defence. Richard White played his Maester's prize at the Grey Friars within Newgate at 3 kind of weapons, that is to say the longsword, the bastard sword, and the backsword. Robert Edmonds played his Maester's prize at the Whitehall before King Philip and Queen Mary at the 3 kind of weapons, that is to say the longsword, the backsword, and the staff. There played against him 2 Maesters, viz. Richard White and Thomas Weaver. And Thomas Weaver was made Maester by King Edward VI at Greenwich. Isaac Kennard came into the place to play his Maester's prize at the ball within Bishopsgate, the 21st day of April, at 4 kinds of weapons, that is to say, the two-hand sword, the backsword, the sword and buckler, and the rapier and dagger. There played with him 3 Maesters, George Green, William Mucklow, and William Joyner. John Blenkinsop played his Maester's prize the 1st day of June at the Artillery Garden at 4 kind of weapons, that is to say the two-hand sword, the backsword, the sword and buckler, and the staff. William Matthews played his Maester's prize at Canterbury the 5th day of June at 4 kind of weapons, that is to say the longsword, the backsword, the sword and buckler, and the rapier and dagger. English martial artists of this period, like some of their modern counterparts, loved the thrill of competitions, which they called challenges. The records of the Maesters contain notes of these events. First, a challenge played at Hampton Court by William Pascal, Richard White, and Robert Edmund before King Henry VIII at 3 sundry kind of weapons, that is to say the longsword, the backsword, and the staff against all provosts and maesters, which challenge was allowed. Another one, a challenge played at Westminster before King Philip and Queen Mary by Richard White, Maester, at 10 kind of weapons. They played with him fewer, that is to say, William Hunt and Thomas Weaver, Robert Edmund, and William Hearn. A challenge played at Westminster before Queen Elizabeth by Richard White, William Hearn, and Robert Edmund. Challengers, and there played Thomas Weaver against Richard White, and William Hearn and William Joyner against Robert Edmund. There are other entries of challenges and prizes in the records of the Maesters, but at this point it may prove interesting to step forward in time and examine a few challenges recorded in the days of the stage gladiator. These later descriptions of challenges tend to give more detail of the fighters and their method. The 1775 compilation of Gross Antiquarian Repertory contains a translation of note. Published in 1672 by Jorvin de Rochefort, that describes a fight between stage gladiators they had witnessed during a visit to England. We went to see the Bear Garden, which is a real great amphitheatre where combats are fought between all sorts of animals and sometimes men, as we once saw. Commonly, when any fencing masters are desirous of showing their courage and their great skill, they issue mutual challenges, and before they engage, parade the town with drums and trumpets, sounding to inform the public that there is a challenge between 2 brave masters of the science of defence, and that the battle will be fought on such a day. We went to see this combat, which was performed on a stage in the middle of this amphitheatre, where on the flourishes of trumpets and the beat of drums, the combatants entered stripped to their shirts. On a signal from the drum, they drew their swords and immediately began the fight, skirmishing a long time without any wounds. They were both very skillful and courageous. The tallest had the advantage over the least, for according to the English fashion of fencing, they endeavoured rather to cut than push in the French manner, so that by this height he had the advantage of being able to strike his antagonist on the head against which the little one was on his guard. He had in his turn an advantage over the great one in being able to give him a Jarnac stroke by cutting him on his right hand, which he left in a manner quite unguarded, so that all things considered, they were equally matched. Nevertheless, the tall one struck his antagonist on the wrist, which he almost cut off. But this did not prevent him from continuing the fight. After he had been dressed and taken a glass or two of wine to give him courage, when he took ample vengeance for his wound. For a little afterwards, making a feint at the ham, the tall man, stooping in order to parry it, made his whole head open, and the little one gave him a stroke which took off a slice of his head and almost all of his ear. The surgeons immediately dressed them and bound up their wounds, which being done they resumed their combat, and both being sensible of their respective disadvantages, they therefore were a long time without giving or receiving a wound, which was the cause that the little one, failing to parry so exactly, being tired with his long battle, received a stroke on his wounded wrist, which dividing the sinews he remained vanquished, and the tall conqueror received the applause of the spectators. Another account of a challenge between stage gladiators came to us from the pen of Herr von Uffenbach, who was in England in 1710. In the afternoon we drove to the bear garden at Hockley in the Hole to watch the fights that take place there, a truly English amusement. First, a properly printed challenge was carried round and dealt out. Not only were all the conditions of the fight there set forth, but also the weapons to be used. The combatants were an Englishman and a Moor. The former was called Thomas Wood and the latter George Turner. The Moor is by profession a fencing master. The place where the fight took place was fairly large. In the middle was a platform as tall as a man of middling height. It had no rail and was open all round, so that neither of the fighters could retreat. Then the master and the fighter I mentioned above appeared themselves. They had taken off their coats and tied only a handkerchief round their heads. First they bowed in every direction and then showed their swords. All round these were very broad and long and uncommonly sharp. Each of the combatants had his second by him, with a large stick in his hand. They were not there to parry blows, but only to see that there was fair play on all sides. They began the fight with broadsword. The Moor got the first wound above his breast, which bled not a little. Then the onlookers began to cheer and call for wood. They threw down vast quantities of shillings and crowns, which were picked up by his second. In the second round, the Englishman, Wood, took a blow above the loins of such force that not only did his shirt hang in tatters, but his sword was knocked out of his hand, and all the buttons on one side of the open breeches he wore were cut away. Then they went for each other, with sword and dagger, and the Moor got a nasty wound in the hand, which bled freely. It was probably due to this that when they attacked each other twice with sword and buckler, that is to say with broadsword and shield, the good Moor received such a dreadful blow that he could not fight any longer. He was slashed from the left thigh right down to his cheek, to his chin and jaw, with such force that one could hear the sword grating against his teeth. Straightway not only the whole of his shirt front, but the platform too was covered with blood. The wound gaped open as wide as a thumb, and I cannot tell you how ghastly it looked on the black face. A barber surgeon immediately sprang forwards and sewed up the wound, while the Moor stood there without flinching. When this had been done, and a cloth bound round his head, the Moor would have liked to continue with the fight, but since he bled so profusely, neither the surgeon nor the seconds who act as umpires would allow this. So the combatants shook hands, as did after each round, and prepared to get down. And there are many such descriptions of challenges in the days of the stage gladiators. But to include any more might seem to be praising the gore that went with their glory. However, the examples given prove that commercial martial arts were almost as dangerous as the battlefield version from which they sprang. Thank you for listening to this episode, and these words were taken from the book English Martial Arts by Terry Brown. Thank you.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.